Okay, so today we're going to dive into some recently declassified documents, and they're connected to the JFK assassination. Now, we're not necessarily looking for, like concrete answers or anything, but these records, they offer some pretty intriguing glimpses into, what different intelligence agencies were up to and thinking about, especially in the years surrounding this just pivotal moment in American history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, anyone who's even remotely followed this event, the JFK assassination, knows that there is just a mountain of information out there.
Oh, yeah.
It can be super overwhelming. So what we're going to do today is try to pull out the most significant threads from these documents and kind of see where they lead us. Think of it like we're sifting through these fascinating, sometimes cryptic pieces of a puzzle.
Exactly, yeah. And the collection we're looking at today, it includes stuff like memorandums, those internal routing slips, personnel lists, and it spans, get this, from the early 1960s all the way to the late 1970s.
Wow.
So we're talking about a pretty significant time frame here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's important.
That's key because it lets us see not just, the immediate aftermath of the assassination in November 1963, but also, maybe some longer term consequences or areas where these agencies were still really interested even years later.
And, just to be totally upfront, our goal here isn't to push any one theory about the assassination. We're not here to say, oh, this is what definitely happened or anything like that. Instead, what we're going to do is really just try to impartially examine what these records say, the content itself.
Yeah.
We'll discuss what they reveal, whether it's directly or indirectly, in relation to President Kennedy's death.
All right, so let's get started. The first document up is titled 104-1061-10386.pdf. This one's a memorandum dated December 18th, 1975, and it's all about a FOIA appeal.
Oh, FOIA? Okay.
Yeah, Freedom of Information Act. So this appeal was for records that were related to, and I'm quoting here, subject. And the subject was identified as John W. Donovan, case number 75F577. Okay, so right off the bat, we see that even more than a decade after the assassination, people were still really trying to get information about this period using FOIA requests. This case shows that the desire to uncover what might have happened back then, it didn't just fade away.
Right. And this memo actually spells out how the CIA responded to Mr. Donovan's appeal. It mentions that, yeah, they did hand over some original agency documents, but there's a catch. They were sanitized.
Sanitized? What does that mean?
Yeah, so that basically means they removed certain parts of the documents, like they redacted some stuff.
Ah, okay. So they're giving him information, but not all of it.
Exactly. And they did that under specific exemptions within the FOIA. The memo actually refers to Title 5 USC 552, specifically subsections B1, B3, and B6. Now, to break that down a bit, those sections generally protect classified information, the super secret stuff. Then there's information that's exempted by other laws, and also anything that could be seen as an invasion of someone's privacy.
So there are legal reasons why they might hold back certain things.
Exactly.
Okay, but what's interesting is that the memo also gives us some background on this case. It mentions that two documents that came from the Deputy Directorate for Operations, the DDO, basically like the CIA's operational arm. Well, those were initially completely withheld.
Oh, wow.
And there were two other DDO documents that were also kept under wraps. And get this, the memo says that Mr. Donovan wasn't even told about any actions that the Domestic Activities Division took. And there's no record that these documents were even sent to that division in the first place.
So it's like over 10 years after the assassination, they're still being really careful about what they release.
Yeah, very hush-hush about certain documents. And the fact that they initially withheld those DDO documents, the ones from the operational side of the CIA, that makes you wonder, what were they so worried about? What was in those documents that they felt they couldn't share even after all these years?
Makes you think.
It does. And then the memo goes on to give recommendations. So they suggest that all documents that were classified secret should be downgraded to confidential.
Okay, so a little less secret, but still not public knowledge.
Right. And importantly, they recommend that more information should be given to Mr. Donovan. But, they still say they can withhold stuff as long as it's justified under those B1 and B3 exemptions we talked about. So it's like they're trying to be a bit more open, but there are definitely still boundaries.
It's interesting that even with this move towards more transparency, they're still really protective of things like, the names of people who work for the agency and internal details about how they're organized. Why would that kind of stuff still be so sensitive so long after 1963?
Yeah, it's a good question.
And then they go on to talk about a few specific documents. There's a memo dated March 5, 1962, and they said that one could be released but with parts deleted. They wanted to protect what they called operational use, the names of agency employees, and again, that internal organizational data. And there's another memo from March 30, 1962, that they also recommend releasing with those same types of redactions.
So there's definitely a pattern here. They're consistent in what they want to keep hidden.
Right. And then there's this FBI memorandum from March 1950 that they initially said no to completely, but then they changed their mind and said they could release a sanitized version, meaning, with some things taken out.
Sanitized.
This time, though, they wanted to protect not just their own people and their internal stuff, but also the privacy of any other individuals who were mentioned in the memo and even the specific file numbers. And then there's an Army memorandum from September 1954, similar story, denied at first, but then okayed for a sanitized release with basically the same categories of information protected.
Interesting. So even documents from before the Kennedy administration were being scrutinized. It makes you think, what was going on back then that might still be relevant to the assassination?
It's true.
Maybe there are connections or patterns that we're not seeing.
And here's another thing. This is a detail from the memo that I thought was kind of interesting. For 2 of these documents, the only copies they had were on microfilm.
Oh, wow. Microfilm.
Yeah, and they actually said in the memo that it'd be tough to make readable copies from the microfilm and that they had to tell the person requesting the documents about this.
So even the format of the records is adding another layer of complexity to all of this. It kind of shows you the challenges of dealing with historical information. I mean, we're talking about a time when microfilm was a standard way of storing things. Today, we're so used to digital records, but back then it was a different world.
Yeah, totally. And, thinking about how all this connects back to the JFK assassination, this 1975 document really shines a light on what it was like trying to declassify information, even more than a decade after the event. And the categories of information that they're so determined to protect, like how they run their operations and the identities of the people involved, those are often the very things that people speculate about when it comes to potential hidden aspects of the assassination.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, if they were still so concerned about revealing those details in the mid-1970s, what exactly were they trying to keep under wraps? And could any of it actually help us better understand what happened back in November 1963? It's
yeah.
Are we just seeing the tip of the iceberg here?
Possibly, yeah. All right, let's move on to the next document. This one's labeled 104-162-1000-05.pdf. It's a memorandum from June 16, 1978, and it's a list of DDO division officers. These were the officers who were assigned to the Soviet branch of the Tokyo Station back in 1963, the year Kennedy was killed.
Tokyo Station, huh? That's interesting. And this is 1978, so we're talking about 15 years after the assassination. What's going on here?
Well, right at the top of the memo, there's a handwritten note, and that note says that a Mr. Oglesby, who is an investigator with the HSCA, the House Select Committee on Assassinations,
right. Yeah.
He requested interviews with these officers back in 1978.
Wow. So even 15 years after Kennedy's death, Congress was still actively looking into this. And they were interested in specific CIA personnel who were stationed in Tokyo during that time. That really raises some questions, doesn't it? Like, why Tokyo? Why focus on these particular individuals?
Yeah, especially considering everything we just talked about with that previous document, how they were so careful about protecting information about their operations and their people. And now we see this congressional committee specifically asking to talk to these officers. It definitely suggests that there was something about those Tokyo operations that they thought could be relevant to the assassination.
And remember, Tokyo Station back then, their main focus would have been on Cold War activities, especially anything having to do with the Soviet Union. So was the HSCA exploring some kind of international angle to the assassination? Were they looking for a Soviet connection or maybe something else entirely?
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely makes you think.
It does. So who are these officers that the HSCA wanted to talk to?
Well, the memo lists them out, gives their retirement status, and when they were in Tokyo, if they had served there. So there's George A. Phil. He was retired, and he was in Tokyo from May 1960 to July 1964. And then Robert M. Keith, also retired. He was there from November 1958 to August 1963.
Okay.
And Hayami Sato, he retired in Japan, and he had a long stint in Tokyo from January 1952 to August 1964. Then there's Peter M. Slobogin, retired. He was there from June 1961 to October 1964. And Royal Tyler, who resigned, he was in Tokyo from March 1962 1962 to March 1964, and then Rudolph Riddell listed as consigned from 1960 to October 1983.
Consigned. That's an unusual term. I wonder what that signifies.
Yeah, it's not clear exactly what that means in this context, but, it's another one of those little details that makes you curious.
For sure. So did any of these officers actually end up talking to the HSCA?
Yeah, actually several of them did. The memo mentions that they were interviewed by the HSCA investigator in April of 1978. So there's Leo Rosenbaum, who was retired and served from May 1960 to June 1965. And George Javon Prigel, also retired, same dates of service as Rosenbaum. Then there's Howard M. Ott, retired. He was there from February 1961 to November 1963. And Hope T. Mason, who was still employed by the CIA at the time, she was in Tokyo from August 1961 to August 1963. And lastly, there's Robert, or Pete Wheeler, retired October 1959 to August 1963.
So a good number of them did end up being interviewed, but what about the others? The memo also lists some personnel who were assigned to the Soviet section of the Tokyo station. It mentions Tadatoshi Izumoto, who retired in Japan, Tom Matsui, who was still working at the station when this memo was written, Masaki Nagao, who was retired, and Kiyoshi Sasaki. Do we know if any of these individuals were contacted by the HSCA?
It doesn't say.
Another mystery. And, it's also worth noting that there are some handwritten annotations on this document. One of them mentions a Will Dunham as the superior of someone named Ulat, and there's also some contract information that's jotted down for Izumimoto, Matsui, Nagao, and Sasaki.
Yeah, those little handwritten notes, they always make you wonder, what were they thinking when they wrote that down?
Right. Like, are these just random bits of information, or are they clues to something more significant? It's hard to know for sure. But, to go back to your original question about how this document connects to the JFK assassination, the fact that the HSCA was so interested in talking to these particular CIA officers, especially the ones who were stationed in Tokyo in 1963, well, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, I mean, it really makes you question what they were hoping to find out from these guys. Like, what pieces of the puzzle were they trying to put together?
It's almost like they were following a trail of breadcrumbs. And this Tokyo station was one of the stops along the way. What's particularly interesting is that they were focusing on the Soviet branch. So was there something about the CIA's activities related to the Soviet Union that they thought could shed light on the assassination? It really makes you think.
For sure. And the fact that all of this was happening so many years after the event, it just goes to show how much mystery still surrounds this case.
Absolutely. The JFK assassination is one of those events that just continues to fascinate and intrigue people, even decades later. And these documents, they just add another layer to the puzzle. They give us these little glimpses into what was going on behind the scenes, but they also raise more questions than they answer.
All right, so we're going to move on now to a couple of other documents and some handwritten notes as well. These ones really dive into the interview requests we've been talking about, and they give us even more information about the people involved. We've got 104, 1062, 10062, 1062, 104, 10062.pdf.
Okay, so we're getting deeper into the weeds here.
Yeah, we are. So the first one, 104, 10062, 10062.pdf. This is a memo from 1978, and it's from a Maurice A. Severn to a Mr. Gary M. Chase. The memo is about requests that came from the Fraser Committee.
Ah, the Fraser Committee. Remind me, who were they again?
Right. So that was another congressional group, but their focus was on intelligence activities in general, and it seems like they wanted to talk to some retired DDO officers.
Makes sense, considering their focus. So who were they interested in?
Well, the memo names 4 individuals. James J. Angleton, he was a big name in CIA counterintelligence, the guy who was obsessed with finding Soviet moles within the agency. And then there's George C. Constantinides, Thomas H. Karamessinis, and William E. Nelson. And the memo actually says that both Nelson and Constantinides had already been told about these requests for interviews.
Interesting. So there were multiple congressional committees poking around in the CIA's business. It makes you wonder if there was any coordination between them or if they were pursuing separate lines of inquiry, like were they all working together to get to the bottom of things, or were they competing with each other?
Yeah, good question. And it wasn't just congressional committees that were looking for these former intelligence officers. We've got this routing slip from 1978, and it's about a phone call that came in asking for the addresses and phone numbers for Pete Bagley and Newton Myler.
Pete Bagley, wasn't he involved in some of the CIA's most sensitive operations?
He was, yeah. And the routing slip says that they did manage to find information for a Roger Gabrielson, who was living in Belgium at the time, and for a Mr. Miles, who was in New Mexico.
So they were even tracking down people who had moved abroad. That shows how determined they were to reach these individuals.
Exactly. It's like no stone was left unturned. And then we've got these lists, just lists of names. And next to each name, there's a note about their status, whether they're retired, still working, undercover, blocked, or if there's just no record of them. And some of the entries have these little cryptic notes, things like not undercover, state cover, and even blocked no address.
Wow. So many layers of secrecy.
I know. It's like trying to decipher a code. And it really gives you a sense of how complex and secretive the world of intelligence agencies can be.
For sure. And did any of those names on the list jump out at you?
They did. There's an entry for a David Phillips, and it lists a Bethesda address. And next to his name, someone's written possibly Tokyo. So it's like maybe he was connected to those Tokyo operations that we were talking about earlier.
Oh, that's a possible link. It could suggest a whole network of people who were involved in those operations, people who might have been of interest to investigators, especially if they were looking at potential connections between the CIA and the assassination.
Yeah, and then there's this record of an index search for Vanderbilt. They ended up with multiple entries for people with that last name, all with different file numbers. Some of these entries go back to the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and some of them even have the classification OSS refs available, which means there were references to those individuals in files from the Office of Strategic Services.
The OSS, that was the precursor to the CIA, right?
That's right. So it's like they were digging deep into the history of these intelligence agencies, trying to find any scrap of information that might be relevant.
And the fact that they were searching for the name Vanderbilt, that's intriguing. Was there a specific individual they were interested in, or were they just casting a wide net? And what was it about the Vanderbilt family or someone connected to them that drew their attention?
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely adds another layer of intrigue to all of this.
It does. And when we step back and look at all of these documents, all these interview requests and cryptic notes, it really underscores just how much effort was still being put into investigating the JFK assassination. Even years later, both the Fraser Committee and the HSCA, they were determined to talk to anyone who might have had even the smallest piece of information that could help them understand what happened.
And it's not just about uncovering the truth of what happened on that day in Dallas. It's also about understanding the context, the bigger picture. These lists and search requests, they hint at this complex web of connections and relationships within the intelligence community. And it's natural to wonder if any of those connections or the activities of those individuals played any kind of role, whether directly or indirectly, in the events surrounding the assassination.
Exactly. And these documents also remind us that history is rarely black and white. There are often more questions than answers, and even seemingly insignificant details can end up being crucial pieces of the puzzle. It's like a detective story that never truly ends.
All right, so for the last part of our deep dive today, we're going to switch gears a little bit and look at some documents from 1972 and 1973. These ones might seem like they're about something completely different, but stick with us because we'll tie it all together in the end. We're going to be looking at 104, 10063, 101, 409.pdf, 104, 1063, 10152.pdf, 104, 1000153.pdf, 104, 1063, 1000162.pdf, 104 1000162.pdf, and 104 10162.pdf, and 104 10063 10169.pdf.
A whole lot of numbers there. What are these documents about?
Yeah, it's a mouthful, I know. So these documents deal with hijacking incidents and the American radicals who were involved in them. We've got secret cables that came from Algiers and Dar es Salaam, and also messages from headquarters in Paris.
Hijacking. Wow, that seems pretty far removed from the JFK assassination.
It does, but there might be more of a connection than you think. So the first document, 104 10063 10149.pdf, it's a secret cable from Algiers in October 1972. And it talks about two guys, Melvin McNair and William Holder. McNair, he hijacked a Delta Airlines plane, and Holder, he hijacked a Western Airlines plane. And it turns out Holder had ties to the Black Panthers. The cable says that both of these guys were in Algiers at the time.
The Black Panther, that's an interesting detail. They were a pretty radical group back then. So what were these hijackers doing in Algiers? Were they seeking asylum?
That's what it seems like. And the cable mentions that McNair was trying to distance himself from Eldridge Cleaver. Cleaver was a big name in the Black Panther Party, and he was also living in exile in Algeria at the time. And then the cable says that Holder was claiming that Cleaver still had control over the BPP's internal security.
So there were some internal power dynamics going on within the Black Panther Party, even in exile. And the CIA was keeping tabs on all of it.
Yeah, they were definitely paying attention. The cable also says that neither McNair nor Holder had any kind of Algerian identification and that they were being restricted in terms of where they could go in the country. Oh, and there's this interesting little detail. The cable says that McNair didn't believe that the Algerians would actually give back the $1 million that was taken during the Delta hijacking.
$1 million. That's a hefty sum.
It is. All right, so then we jump ahead to 1973, and we've got this secret cable from Dar es Salaam. This one's about a guy they call OBOWL1, but it turns out that's actually Pete O'Neill.
Wait, Pete O'Neill, the Black Panther leader?
The one and only.
Wow. Okay, so this is getting more interesting.
Right. So the cable says that O'Neill had been visited by a Fred Johnson, and it also mentions John Manning and George Rice, who were arrested by the Tanzanian authorities in December of '72.
Okay, so we're seeing a lot of movement and activity among these American radicals who are living in Africa, and the CIA is clearly monitoring them. But what's the significance of all this? How does it tie back to the JFK assassination?
Well, we'll get to that, but first there are a couple more documents I want to mention. There's this secret message from headquarters, and it talks about the possibility that George Edward Wright, one of the hijackers we mentioned earlier, and William Holder might be planning to travel outside of Algiers. So it seems like the CIA was concerned about their movements.
Right.
And then perhaps the most revealing document in this whole set is a 1973 secret message that came from Paris. This message talks about an apparatus that was helping 6 American black militant/hijackers who were living in Algeria. And they name them. Wright, Holder, McNair, George Brown, and Joyce Tillerson Burgess.
An apparatus. What do they mean by that?
Yeah, it's not entirely clear, but it seems like it refers to some kind of network or organization that was providing support to these individuals. The message goes on to say that these guys were living clandestine lives in Algeria and that people were working to arrange plastic surgery and fake documents for them so they could sneak back into the United States.
Wow, so they were going to great lengths to help these fugitives disappear. That's a pretty big deal. And it definitely suggests that there were some powerful forces at work here. But again, how does any of this relate to the JFK assassination?
Right, that's the question. So here's the thing. These documents might not directly link to the assassination itself, but they do show us a world where hijacking, radical groups, and foreign countries all intersect. And some people who research the JFK assassination believe that these kinds of connections, these networks of individuals who are operating outside the law might have played some kind of role, even if it was indirect, in the events surrounding Kennedy's death.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
So you're saying that maybe some of the same people or networks that were involved in these later activities, like the hijackings and the support for these radicals, maybe they were also active in the early 1960s.
Exactly. It's definitely speculative, but it's a theory that's worth considering. And the fact that these documents exist at all, that the CIA was keeping track of these individuals and their movements, it just adds another layer to the whole JFK mystery.
And it makes you think about the bigger picture. Like, what was the political climate like in those years following Kennedy's death? Was there a sense of instability, of things being in flux? And could that have created an environment where these kinds of clandestine activities were more likely to occur? It's all connected.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from FOIA requests to CIA personnel in Tokyo to hijackers in Algeria. It's been a pretty wild ride.
It has. And, it's important to remember that these documents, they're just a small piece of the overall puzzle. There's so much more information out there. And even the information we do have, it's often open to interpretation.
And that's actually what I wanted to leave our listeners with today. Think about everything we've discussed, all these different threads of information, and ask yourself, what does it all mean? What does it tell us about the lasting impact of the JFK assassination? And what does it say about the intelligence community and their activities during that time? There are no easy answers, but I think it's important to keep asking these questions.
I agree. And I encourage everyone to keep digging, keep exploring these historical records, and keep forming their own conclusions. Because the JFK assassination, it's a story that continues to unfold even today. And who knows, maybe one day we'll finally have all the pieces of the puzzle. But until then, the search for the truth goes on.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap things up for today. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.
See you then.